Welcome back, guys. All right, we're going to talk today about the Cold War. My name is Dr. Chris Erskine, and my question to you now is on this first slide, what is the Cold War? What is it? And when is the Cold War? Now, the chapter that you're talking about with the Cold War gets into the 1950s, and there's so many details, there's so many things that you could talk about in this chapter, so many really important things. I mean, if I'm in class in a classroom, I'm spending a lot of time talking about these things with my classes. And so because we can't do that here, because we're only doing, about 10-minute lectures, what you're going to do is answer questions about some of these things. And some of your assignments that you have for this course are going to cover some of these other things. So for this lesson, what I really want to focus on is for you to understand what the Cold War was and to understand when it happened and why it started. So let's start with this very first slide. The Cold War era was from about 1945 to about 1991. That's what this picture says. But actually, this is because they say that the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Japan in 1945. I want to say actually that the Cold War probably began closer to 1947. And we'll see why in just a moment. And so the Cold War is this struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States. At the time, the Soviet Union, the United States was really afraid of communist Russia. Now, the United States isn't as afraid of those kinds of things today, but because it was political, politicians in the United States made sure that they said that the person that they didn't agree with politically, they called them a communist, or they called them a liberal, or they called them some name, or they called them pink was a word, because communism is red in the flags. And so this was the big scare. And in 1991, things kind of disappeared, and the fear of that also, some of that fear disappeared. And just like the communists were scared of capitalism, they became less afraid of capitalism. And so today, the countries are moving closer together, and this is a good thing, that we're more friendly with one another. But you can see on this map, this is the Soviet influence in Europe after World War II, and all those red areas, or those darker areas, those were places that were really controlled by the Soviet Union. So let's start this out. In March of 1946, on this next slide, Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister of England, gives a speech in the United States, in the state of Missouri, and he says this: "An iron curtain has descended across the continent of Europe." Now, what he means is that information doesn't go in, information doesn't come out, you can't travel that way, you can't travel, there's no trade relationships, it's just completely two separate groups of people, two separate groups of nations. And so that gave the rise to the phrase, the Iron Curtain. On the next slide, we see something called the long telegram. And these are steps that we move toward the Cold War. That's kind of how we understand these things. George Kennan was an American diplomat, a government official in Moscow, Russia. And he wrote this telegram that we now today call the long telegram. And he writes this in 1946. And in this telegram, he's talking about how he's trying to understand how Russia behaves. Now, that telegram later becomes an article in a magazine called Foreign Affairs in 1947. And he doesn't want to put his name on it, so it's written by Mr. X, and it becomes known as the X article. Now, if we look at the next slide, this X article is called not the long telegram, but it's called the Sources of Soviet Conduct. And this is what he says: "The USSR, Soviet Russia, sees itself forever, perpetual, in forever war with capitalist countries, with the United States, with England, with Canada, with Australia." That's the first thing. And the second thing is the USSR, Soviet Russia, will be friends with communist and capitalist countries, meaning that they will come to the United States and try to get Americans and Canadians and British to perhaps spy on the United States and help overthrow the United States government. So this really made Americans afraid. And so Americans began looking around. Who's communist? Who's sympathetic to to the Russians? Who's sympathetic to those people? So it was a major fear. We call it, in the United States, we call it the Red Scare. We have two of them. One of them is after World War I, and one is after World War II. On the next slide, we can see the Soviet goal, and this is what Kennan says, is to fill every nook and cranny in the world basin of power. It's like an octopus wrapping its legs and tentacles all around the country, all around the world. So if you think about a frying pan, when you put hot oil in a frying pan before you fry an egg, you can shake that around, and as the heat heats that up, that oil spreads. And in American minds, that's the idea that the Soviet Union and their power is going to control the entire world. And so this policy of containment, how do we keep the Soviets in a certain space? How do we keep them from not adding more countries? We don't want to take away from what they have now, but we want to stop them from spreading. And that was a major concern of Americans from 1945 or 6 until 1991 at the end of the Cold War. Now on the next slide, Stalin gives a speech in February of 1946, and the United States interprets this as a declaration of war, of World War III. He says the United States and the Soviet ideas, ideologies, they cannot coexist, meaning they cannot both exist in the world. One of them will take the other one. And this is how the United States understands Stalin's speech. And so it's very scary. So all of these things, Stalin's speech, the long telegram, Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, these are all happening around the same time. And then finally, in 1947, Harry Truman, President Truman, issues what's called the Truman Doctrine, in which he says that the United States is going to help people that need help everywhere in the world. And so that meant that the United States would go to these places and help fight against the Soviet power. And so to help with that, in 1947, the United States passed the National Security Act, and as part of that comes the Air Force, but it also comes the Department of Defense. So the Department of War changes to the Department of Defense, and importantly creates the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. And you can see that CIA logo on this slide. And so that's a major, major step towards trying to combat the Soviet power during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s. On the next slide, we see an election, the presidential election, and Truman wins re-election. And it's not close. He wins most of the major states. He loses New York, and that's a big state. He loses some New England states. It is close, but he actually thinks he's going to lose to Dewey. He doesn't lose, but he thinks he's going to. And America thinks he's going to lose as well. On the next slide, we can see, so he continues to be president. And on the next slide, we can see 1948, Stalin has tightened his grip. He's consolidated, brought it together, power of the Eastern European countries. And so in response to that, the United States, Canada, England, Western Europe form what's called NATO. Now, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And NATO is a group of countries that work together and have a military that works together to protect themselves from Soviet power. And that's in 1949. In that same year, the Soviet Union explodes its first atomic bomb. And that's scary for Americans because now someone else, our worst enemy, has an atomic bomb. And so now, who can build a bigger bomb? And now the arms race is on. And in response to NATO, the Soviet Union forms its own treaty organization called the Warsaw Pact, in which Soviet nations allied themselves. And so that if NATO attacked one of these countries, all of the Warsaw Pact, all of the Soviet countries would go to war against NATO. Very dangerous, and that's how World War I actually began. On the next slide, we can see that from June 1948 to May of 1949, there was something called the Berlin Airlift, in which Stalin wanted the United States to get out of Berlin because Berlin is this little city in the middle of communist East Germany. But Berlin is there, and it has an airport. And the United States are landing and taking off a plane every 3 minutes around the clock for several months. And they're providing supplies to West Berliners, where Stalin had cut off all the road access and railroad access, and so we can't send food in. Stalin thinks that the Americans are soft and that we will eventually give up. And so he responds by building a wall, not immediately after the Berlin Airlift, but he decides that the only way to kind of contain West Berlin and the people in West Berlin is to build a wall around the city, keep people out, and keep the West Berliners in. And so in April 1949, the United States joins NATO, which we talked about just a moment ago. And in 1949, Stalin ends the May of 1949, they end the blockade, and so it's almost a year long. It's about 10 months that this Berlin blockade, every 3 minutes, planes are flying in and out of Berlin, American planes, for 10 months. In May 1949, the Allies ended the occupation of West Germany, and they removed the military troops, and now it's just a democracy there after May of 1949. And so a lot is happening. Tension is rising. And so we can see on the next slide, the Cold War has begun between the Soviet Union and the United States. It's a major moment, the last 2 or 3 years of the 1940s. And for the next 30 or 40 years, school children will go to school and they will do drills, and they will hear a siren in the classroom, whoop, 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 and the children will have to run and get under their desks because they're afraid the atomic bomb is going to be dropped on them. And and I did this when I was younger, and I remember that we knew this was a drill, that it was practice, but it was scary. And my parents did it as well. So it's a scary thing. Thankfully, the Cold War is over, and we did not have nuclear war, but we came really close a couple of times. And we're going to talk about some of those times in the next chapter. Talk to you guys then. Bye-bye.